At this point, young Frederick Douglass was enslaved to Mr. and Mrs. Hugh in Baltimore, and his situation was relatively decent in comparison to the other slaves. But suddenly, big news hit home, which caused a change in Mr. Douglass's circumstance. In his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, he tells us exactly what that news was and what happened afterwards. He says,
"In a very short time after I went to Baltimore, my old master's youngest son, Richard, died, and in 3 years and 6 months after his death, my old master himself died, leaving only his son, Andrew, and his daughter, Lucretia, to share his estate."
Old Master's son Richard and Old Master himself, who was also known as Captain Anthony, both yielded up the ghost, and now he's left with 2 kids, Andrew and Lucretia. Andrew we'll deal with in a bit, but Lucretia was a woman who Douglass knew on Colonel Lloyd's plantation, and this is before he was sent off to Baltimore. He considered Lucretia to be kind and a friend. She would give him extra bread and butter when he was hungry, and one time, when this boy Ike cracked him across the forehead with an iron object, it was Lucretia who wrapped up the bloody wound as she tended to him, and this is after Aunt Katie sat there and paid no attention to him. She just let him sit there hollering and she chastised him. So as a kid, he liked Lucretia. Now, what does Old Master's death and Andrew and Lucretia sharing his estate have anything to do with young Douglass? We're about to find out.
The old man died while on a visit to his daughter in Hillsborough, where Captain Auld and Mrs. Lucretia now lived. The former, having given up the command of Colonel Lloyd's sloop, was now keeping a store in that town.
A sloop is a small sailing ship. Captain Anthony, or Old Master, used to manage one of these for Colonel Lloyd, but he stopped and he began managing a store in Hillsborough before he died.
Cut off, thus unexpectedly, Captain Anthony died intestate,
meaning without leaving a living will,
and his property must now be equally divided between his 2 children, Andrew and Lucretia.
Since he didn't have a will specifying exactly how his property and possessions should be divided, by default, it was divided equally amongst his children, Andrew and Lucretia. And again, what does this have to do with young Douglass?
That was a sad day for me, a sad day for little Tommy, and a sad day for my dear Baltimore mistress and teacher when I left for the Eastern Shore to be valued and divided.
Although he was sent off to stay with Mr. Hugh Auld in Baltimore, he was not legally owned by him. He was still the lawful property of Old Master. And now it's his time to be divided amongst the children, which he said was a sad day. A sad day for Tommy, who was Mr. and Mrs. Auld's little son, and a sad day for Mrs. Auld because she played somewhat of a maternal figure to young Douglass. And that's why he says,
"We, all 3, wept bitterly that day, for we might be parting, and we feared we were parting forever. No one could tell among which pile of chattels I should be flung. Thus early, I got a foretaste of that painful uncertainty which slavery brings to the ordinary lot of mortals. Sickness, adversity, and death may interfere with the plans and purposes of all, but the slave has the added danger of changing homes, changing hands, and of having separations unknown to other men. Then, too, there was the intensified degradation of the spectacle. What an assemblage! Men and women, young and old, married and single, moral and intellectual beings, in open contempt of their humanity, level at a blow with horses, sheep, horned cattle and swine, horses and men, cattle and women, pigs and children, all holding the same rank in the scale of social existence, and all subjected to the same narrow inspection to ascertain their value in gold and silver, the only standard of worth applied by slaveholders to slaves. How vividly at that moment did the brutalizing power of slavery flash before me. Personality swallowed up in the sordid idea of property. Manhood lost in chattelhood.
Turning humans into things. And that and nothing more would have been his fate if he would have ended up in the hands of the son Andrew. He says that Master Andrew was a drunkard, and he was reckless and he was wasteful with property. Mr. Douglass believed that Andrew would have spent his inheritance quickly, and he would have ended up being sold quickly into the dreaded Deep South. This is where they pick cotton and they work in the rice swamps. So he was definitely concerned at this point, but he was also uncertain and not looking forward to whatever the outcome was. So he says,
"In contemplating the likelihoods and possibilities of our circumstances, I probably suffered more than most of my fellow servants. I had known what it was to experience kind and even tender treatment. They had known nothing of the sort.
He knew what it was like to have a maternal figure like Mrs. Auld, and most of the other slaves on Colonel Lloyd's plantations did not.
Life to them had been rough and thorny, as well as dark. They had, most of them, lived on my old master's farm in Tuckahoe, and had felt the reign of Mr. Plummer's rule,
who was a drunkard who had badly beaten a woman on the plantation with a hard hickory stick. That's who the slaves on Colonel Lloyd's plantation lived under.
The overseer had written his character on the living parchment of most of their backs, and left them callous. My back, thanks to my early removal from the plantation to Baltimore, was yet tender. I had left a kind mistress at Baltimore, who was almost a mother to me."
That's Mrs. Auld. She was the one who taught him his initial lessons on how to read. And in a short time, he was master of the alphabet and could spell words of 3 or 4 letters.
She was in tears when we parted, and the probabilities of ever seeing her again, trembling in the balance as they did, could not be viewed without alarm and agony. The thought of leaving that kind mistress forever, and, worse still, of being the slave of Andrew Anthony, a man who, but a few days before the division of the property, had, in my presence, seized my brother Perry by the throat, dashed him on the ground, and with the heel of his boot stamped him on the head, until the blood gushed from his nose and ears, was terrible.
He was a drunkard and a very violent man, and after dashing Perry to the ground and stomping on his head, he looked over the young Douglas and he said this,
"That is the way I will serve you one of these days."
Uh-oh, and Mr. Douglas knew he meant it, and he couldn't wait to get a hold of him. Now, he only stayed with Andrew for a very short time on his plantation. And surprisingly, Andrew didn't bother him when he was there. His sister Lucretia eventually became the inheritor of young Douglas, and she made the decision to send him back to Baltimore. And she said it was because he was too young. He was better off in Baltimore, and they really didn't have a use for him at that time. So back to live with Mrs. Auld and Tommy he went. Then this happened.
I had returned to Baltimore but a short time when the tidings reached me that my friend, Mrs. Lucretia, who was only second in my regard to Mrs. Hugh Auld, was dead, leaving her husband and only one child, a daughter named Amanda.
Miss Lucretia, his friend, the lady who gave him bread and tended to his head, was now dead. And
shortly after the death of Mrs. Lucretia, strange to say, Master Andrew died, leaving his wife and one child.
Andrew was taken off the planet too.
Thus, the whole family of Anthonys was swept away. Only 2 children remained. All this happened within 5 years of my leaving Colonel Lloyd's. 2 years after the death of Mrs. Lucretia, Master Thomas married his second wife.
Master Thomas Auld is the brother of Mr. Hugh Auld. Mr. Hugh Auld and Mrs. Sophia Auld, along with Tommy, is who Douglas lived with in Baltimore. This is their relationship. So after Miss Lucretia died, Thomas Auld married his next wife.
Her name was Rowena Hamilton, the eldest daughter of Mr. William Hamilton, a rich slaveholder on the eastern shore of Maryland, who lived about 5 miles from St. Michael's, the then place of my master's residence. Not long after his marriage, Master Thomas had a misunderstanding with Master Hugh, and, as a means of punishing his brother, he ordered him to send me home.
The 2 brothers had an issue because of this. Thomas had a girl slave who was disabled. He sent the girl to Mr. and Mrs. Auld's house with Tommy. And after some time of her being there, they concluded they had no use for the crippled servant. This is how Mr. Douglas describes it. So they sent her back to Thomas. Thomas took this as a sign of them being ungrateful, and he said, if you don't keep the girl, you can't keep Frederick. So he ordered his brother to send him back home immediately. And why was he able to do this? Because after old master died, Frederick became the property of Lucretia. Lucretia was married to Thomas, which gave him part ownership in Douglas. When Lucretia died, Thomas had ownership rights over Douglas. And since the brother Hugh Auld returned the disabled girl, Thomas made him return Douglas as well because of his ungratefulness.
I was now a big boy. I had become quite useful to several young colored men who had made me their teacher. I had taught some of them to read and was accustomed to spend many of my leisure hours with them.
He picked up the knowledge of reading from his slave masters, and he shared that knowledge with the other slaves who desired to learn.
Our attachment was strong, and I greatly dreaded the separation. But regrets, especially in a slave, are unavailing. I was only a slave, my wishes were nothing, and my happiness was the sport of my masters. My regrets at now leaving Baltimore were not for the same reasons as when I before left that city, to be valued and handed over to my proper owner. My home was not now the pleasant place it had formerly been. A change had taken place, both in Master Hugh and in his once pious and affectionate wife.
Remember, he's getting older now, and now they're starting to view him differently. Even the wife who used to act as a mother to him.
The influence of brandy and bad company on him, and the influence of slavery and social isolation upon her, had wrought disastrously upon the characters of both. Thomas was no longer little Tommy, but was a big boy and had learned to assume the airs of his class toward me.
The seeds of Southern white consciousness began ripening in his character, beginning to be aware of himself as a white person and Frederick as a black person, one to do the ruling and the other to be ruled over.
My condition, therefore, in the house of Master Hugh was not by any means so comfortable as in former years. My attachments were now outside of our family. They were felt to those to whom I imparted instruction, and to those little white boys from whom I received instruction. There, too, was my dear old father, the pious Lawson, who was, in Christian graces, the very counterpart of Uncle Tom. The resemblance is so perfect that he might have been the original of Mrs. Stowe's Christian hero. The thought of leaving these dear friends greatly troubled me, for I was going without the hope of ever returning to Baltimore again, the feud between Master Hugh and his brother being bitter and irreconcilable, or, at least, supposed to be so. In addition to thoughts of friends from whom I was parting, as I supposed, forever, I had the grief of neglected chances of escape to brood over. I had put off running away until now I was to be placed where the opportunities for escaping were much fewer than in a large city like Baltimore.
So he still had escaping on his mind, but he neglected the opportunity to do so. And at this point, he realized that it would be much more difficult to escape in this new place than his current place in the city of Baltimore. But the time was not ripe enough for this to happen. So off to live with Master Thomas Auld he goes. And how was life living with this new master? We'll just have to find out.